Today, we become legends.
We're now less than a month away from the launch of 24/7 Alpha for Smite 2, and as many of you probably know, there's a lot of work to be done, not just for the launch of 24/7 Alpha, but also for the full 24/7 free-to-play launch of the game. Let's talk about the state of the game once again, and what I think should be in this upcoming patch, which Hi-Rez has said will be a big one, and that all of us expect to be a big one as well. So first up, and this one might be a bit hopeful, but I think bare minimum we need to see one completely brand new god and around 5 ported gods for this launch patch. Alpha 4 for Smite 2 went live a week earlier than expected, likely to give them more time to work on this patch as the big one for the launch of 24/7 Alpha, and also the Smite 1 updates, especially 11.8, have been a little bit lacking in content, likely because they're putting their all into the biggest Smite 2 patch since launch. With this extra time and manpower, I think delivering at least one brand new god and 5 ported gods is doable, to give plenty of new content to try out and a reason to stick with Smite 2 for a while rather than playing for a few days and returning to Smite 1. Which honestly I think will happen at this stage regardless, as there's just way more content available in Smite 1, but we've seen time and time again that the god roster and especially new releases are a large part of why people keep coming back to Smite, so I think a large offering of new ones in this update will be key to getting people into playing Smite 2 for the long run rather than just for a weekend or two. 2 brand new gods as some kind of double release would of course be amazing, but that might be wishful thinking at this point. 1 brand new god is essential though, and I can't imagine they don't have that on their mind at Hi-Rez as well. It's just a matter of how many ported gods we'll get, which I think 5 would be a great number, and I'm hoping some of the more complex gods and also some of the ones that really showcase the new systems of Smite 2 super well will be there. Since a lot of the current Smite 2 roster are very basic and hard to play for a super long time without getting bored of them, I know a lot of people do love those kind of designs, but there has to be some kind of a balance, and I feel like at the moment the scales are shifted too much towards these basic boring gods rather than some of the more interesting and complex ones. Moving on from the god roster though, something else I would really like to see for the 24/7 Alpha is a major pass on items. Right now I think only about 30 to 40% of the Smite 2 items are actually fun to use and well balanced, with maybe another 30 to 40% that are a little bit boring or not well designed in a certain way and maybe could be tweaked to work properly, and the rest just being utter garbage that don't really fill a niche and are insanely boring. I'll quickly mention here as well that this video is essentially my ideal patch for everything I think needs work. I'm not saying everything in this video should be there on launch, but I do think the items are a major thing that needs to be looked at for reworks in Smite 2. Tank items especially feel both weak and boring. There are a few standouts, especially some of the active support items I think are really cool, but for the most part, building defense in Smite 2 is inherently nerfed already due to every god being able to do both damage types, and a lot of these tank items need to be buffed up, and I think more mixed defense items need to be introduced. That means both mixed in the sense of items like Spirit Robe or the Stone Tree from Smite 1 where the defense is equal, but also some that have large physical defense and lower magical defense, or the opposite, to fill the needs of some matchups where a god does mostly one damage type but does a little bit of another. You could build those items there. Damage dealer items I think are in a much better spot than tank items, and just a few of those could be looked at for tweaks or reworks, but tank items are in a really bad spot to the point where I don't even want to play solo in Smite 2, and I'm pretty much a mid-jungle main in that game, because solo's god and item pool is just so boring and weak. If you're new to the channel, I'm a highly dedicated solo main in Smite 1, so coming from me saying that I don't want to play solo in Smite 2, there's definitely something that needs to be looked at there. Another thing for items that is simple to do is to just make all of the items that are equivalents from Smite 1 have the same name as Smite 1. There are some items like Binding of Lingvi that are just Stone of Binding, or Leviathan's Hide, which is just Midgardia Mail but slightly different. There are items as well like Chronos Pendant and Executioner that keep the same name and an updated icon. I think all of the items that are the same or very similar to a Smite 1 counterpart should just be named the same, as it makes it easier for people to quickly scan the store and see an item they're familiar with and roughly will know what it will do. Essentially porting an item over from Smite 1 but giving it a different name and icon is just pointless and confusing in my opinion. There's nothing new there besides a name change, and it really just confuses people. Just make it the same for familiarity for existing Smite 1 players, and completely new Smite 2 players won't know or care anyway. And finally for items, I'll harp on this for what feels like the 4th or 5th time at this point, bring back flat penetration on items. I can see the argument that it's just too efficient to increase your damage and everyone always rushes it, but that gives some structure to your build, and it's not always necessarily been true that mid and jungle always rush flat pen first, especially if you distribute it in a smart way that players have to make a real sacrifice on if they want that early game damage spike. As an example, don't put flat pen on Jotuns, but put it on something else with very few other base stats. If the trade-off is 20% CDR and the useful passive of Jotuns versus 10 flat pen, pen, then there's a decision to be made there, rather than just slapping it all onto one item. I think a large part of the issue in Smite 1 with flat pen, if you can even call it an issue really, I don't think it particularly is, but it was never a real trade-off. It was just slapped onto very efficient items like Jotun, Spear of Deso, Do More, Book of Thoth, all that kind of stuff. I think with smarter balancing decisions, you could add flat pen back to the game as an option to boost your early game damage, but not make it an absolute necessity. Oh, and one final note on items, though they're not really items, I think there needs to be at the very least teleport added to the relic options pool, and maybe Aegis as well. While you're at it, you could try an idea I had a while back for Aegis to make it a decaying 100% damage reduction effect to incentivize people to use it at the exact right moment, rather than just being straight up immune for 2 seconds. I also think the aspect system could use another look to make some of the effects more interesting and impactful, and maybe expand upon the system with a smaller tree of effects that you either choose from or get progressively as you go throughout the match, working your way towards that big effect at the bottom. Moving on though, let's talk about the Conquest map a bit. I've said this before a million times, but delete the teleporters and replace them with some kind of unique camp that actually gives a reason for the side jungles to exist in the early game. At the very least, they should be replaced for the first 8 to 10 minutes of the game, similar to Smite 1's teleporters, because as it is, the only action that happens in the side jungles is for the Cyclops camp, and you barely go into them for that anyway, so they may as well not exist for the first 10 minutes until people really start using the teleporters. I'm also still not a massive fan of the rotating buff camps near mid, though I will say with the addition of stacking buffs, they do make a lot more sense. I do still think they're a little uninspired though, and could be replaced with something more interesting. You could even move the effect to back camps, or at a certain infamy level, back camps start dropping a mini 60-second version of a buff effect or something like that, rather than the normal 120 seconds, to give the jungler a sort of mini super soldier effect, where if they're taking their back camps reliably, they can have a couple of little extra buff effects sometimes for their ganks. I don't know, I'm kind of just spitballing random ideas that pop into my head here. I don't necessarily hate the rotating camps, but I think they could be more interesting and better. Also, I know Hi-Rez have said they want to keep the map relatively simple and not immediately release extra bits from like Smite 1's Pyromancer, Trebuchet's Beacon, that kind of stuff, but I do think something extra, probably a Pyromancer equivalent, would do wonders for the pacing of the game. Something to actually fight over in the early and mid game beyond just a camp and maybe Gold Fury. The map just feels a little empty at the moment compared to Smite 1, and as I said, they're holding off on extra features for Conquest immediately, but I think a minor objective of similar importance to Pyromancer will be really good for the game in its current state. You could even tie it into the new mechanics and systems a little bit, like making it give infamy to all of your jungle camps when taken, and maybe even like refresh the duration of all active buffs on your team, or maybe make the next round of buffs into super buffs. I don't know, I just think something extra to make the map feel less empty and boring would be great. Speaking of boring, the gold piles are pretty much the definition of that, and while I know the team are excited about the interact mechanic, I think most players would agree that this is a very boring way to use it. If I remember correctly, there's now only one gold pile left, and that's the one near mid, as they replace the ones in the side lanes. I don't have any specific ideas at the moment on what you could replace this with, but they aren't really hitting the mark at the moment for me. And finally for Conquest, this is a personal one, but I really want the totem back instead of the Warhorn. I completely understand why they replaced it, as they don't want the game to just be Smite 1, but it was probably the best designed mini objective we've ever had, and fits Solo's bruisery long game style so well. Warhorn is kind of fine, but a bit boring in my opinion, and totem would be much better. Tangentially related to Conquest though, I also think roll queue needs to be there for 24/7 alongside a proper MMR system and actual punishments for leaving and trolling. One of the major things that made me and many others not want to grind Smite 2 in the long term and on these alpha weekends is that every game was just a loot box of random players, and you had to pray that you didn't get multiple people who had no idea what was going on or that would rage quit after one death. If the game is going to exist in a 24/7 state, even in alpha, the systems absolutely need to be there and need to be done well to ensure that people can get a fair, balanced and competitive experience. I could tolerate it one weekend in 4, but if Hi-Rez really wants me to play this game consistently every day, the matchmaking needs to be there, and the trolls and leavers need to get suspensions or bans for it. Roll queue will also help with this, as there will be less of that awful feeling where you pick mid and some dude calls no roll and insta-locks Kukulkan. A lot of that will also be fixed with proper MMR and matchmaking, as the decent players will quickly climb out of that cesspool, but punishing those kinds of players and having a roll queue system will help enormously. Ranked would also be nice to be there day one, but for me personally, I don't care that much about ranked and just want fair competitive games, so I can experience what Smite 2 actually will feel like rather than just the shit show we've had for the first 4 alphas with no matchmaking in place. On a similar note, progression systems being in place for 24/7 would also be really nice if they expect us to grind the game consistently. At bare minimum, favor and worshippers should be implemented at this point, but the more the merrier with this kind of stuff, and whatever they have time to fit in terms of progression systems will be really great. There are other things that Smite 2 needs over time, like adding assault in terms of game modes, more new gods, starter items, more map elements, and so much more. But these are things that either aren't a top priority in my opinion, or take a very long time to implement, and while this video has been a bit idealistic, I don't expect everything I've said to be there for the 24/7 launch. There's only so much the devs can do with so little time until this update drops. What do you think though? Is there something else I didn't mention here that you think should be top priority for the 24/7 alpha, let me know down below, and I will catch you guys for another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.